I was born Salvatore Lucania in a town the map forgets, Lercara Fritti, Sicily. They handed me an immigrant's hunger and the old country's codes, but I traded superstition for structure. People called me lucky because luck and I had the same last name. Lucania and Lucania's luck were indistinguishable. The truth is simpler and meaner. I made my own luck. I organized it. If there's one crime in which I'll admit expertise, it's creating systems. You don't survive by being the loudest or the cruelest. You survive by being the man who draws the lines and names the rules. I didn't invent violence. I bureaucratized it. I turned chaos into a boardroom where men voted instead of slaughtering each other in the streets. They would later call it the commission. I called it order. This is my confession. Not the pleading kind under a judge's light, but the confession that comes when a man grows old enough to despise the lies that paid for his table. I'll tell you about Castellammarese and how I ended the reign of kings and capi, about the trial that sent me to Sing Sing in chains, about a wartime bargain that brought my name into Navy files, how the law, the press, and a lifetime of secrecy finally pushed me across an ocean. I'll tell you what the records say, and I'll put the fingerprints of the men who mattered down in the open. Listen close. The papers can tell you the dates. I'll give you the blood. In the years after the Great War, New York was a stew of clans and vendettas. Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano were kings of a dream built on gambling, prostitution, protection. A dream that needed a crown. I'd been Masseria's lieutenant. I knew the system from the inside. It was predictable and ugly. Men died for petty slights. Empires toppled because of a loose word over a card game. I had neither patience for chaos nor appetite for endless blood. In 1931, I ended both kings in the only language that mattered on our streets: efficiency. They called it betrayal. I called it a plan. With a tidy sequence of meetings, murders, and a guarantee that no man would call himself boss of bosses again, I set up a table, not a throne. Heads of the important families would sit, argue, and vote. No more solitary dictators, no more open war for dominance. The commission was born, a judicial panel for criminals, a place where disputes were mediated, not massacred. You could say I modernized the underworld. You could also say I wanted control. Both are true. But power attracts attention. Power makes enemies patient. You hear stories about a single act that brought me down. A raid on brothels, a parade of prostitutes listing a series of men, or a jealous husband who pointed his finger in the right direction. The truth is messier and cleaner at once. The state found a vulnerability and they drove a truck through it. By the mid-1930s, the state of New York had had enough. They wanted a public enemy to nail to a cross and parade through the papers. A series of investigations into prostitution rackets, luminaries, and municipal corruption set the stage. The prosecutor's case, the 1936 trial, used witness testimony, surveillance, and an army of investigative reports to tie me to a system they could not otherwise puncture. They painted me as the boss of a nationwide prostitution ring and argued that I benefited financially from it. The jury believed them. They took me from a desk to a cell, but you should know something about prison. Authority doesn't simply vanish because the state locks a man's door. Influence is a different kind of property. I kept mine. Wartime rewrites every rule. When the United States went to war in '41, the docks of New York became lines on a map. Ships, convoys, and vital supplies moved under the eyes of men who had reasons to watch. The Navy needed port security and intelligence. The government had eyes on the docks, but not the faith of the longshoremen. The longshoremen had leaders who listened to me. You'll read in some accounts the name Operation Underworld. You'll read of meetings between Navy officials and mob intermediaries. Here's what the declassified pages and later reporting agree on. Federal naval agents and district attorneys went to men who could control sabotage and communists and asked for cooperation. They needed men on the piers to watch the docks, to make sure saboteurs didn't find the right ships to keep freight safe. From my cell, my lieutenants had the ear of the waterfront. They could close a pier. They could turn eyes. The government wanted reliability. We wanted leverage. We made a trade. Did I personally cut the deal? The record is contradictory. The Navy and later government officials have been taciturn, embarrassed by what they called a necessary sin, while prosecutors later wrote that my alleged cooperation may have been a factor in the parole board's decision. The bottom line, during the war, men in government approached intermediaries connected to me. Those men acted. The authorities benefited. Whether my hand touched every signature is less important than the fact that the machine moved in concert. Documents and reporters have since pulled at that thread, and the fabric is clear enough to the touch. They tried to make my conviction holy law. The judges read the transcripts, and the public read the headlines. In court, they marshaled women's testimony, ledger books, and the zeitgeist of a city tired of vice. My lawyers fought, of course. We challenged witnesses and evidence. We attacked credibility where we could. But in the end, the jury returned a verdict that changed my life. In Sing Sing, I learned about time in a way men on the outside never will. Time in prison is a ledger. Visits, furloughs, parole hearings, petitions. I petitioned and I waited. When the war rumor unfurled, that my cooperation had been invaluable, it changed the calculus. The parole board and Governor Thomas E. Dewey, and later the Manhattan DA's office, danced with the facts and with political pressure. In January 1946, I was granted conditional release, effectively deported to Italy. There would be no quiet return. The law had the last word on my geography, but not on my influence. Think of that deportation like an arranged marriage with fate. They sent me back across the ocean and, in doing so, gave me a different kind of freedom. One limited by borders, but not by reach. I would build from there, an exile with networks. Before mass media mythologized me, I'd crafted a bloodless architecture for crime. The commission, properly understood, was not a nightclub for sinners. It was a council to cut down skirmishes and to optimize profit. If a man wanted to open a casino or import a contraband chest, he came to the table. We solved problems with ledgers, not with drive-by killings. I brokered peace by giving men a forum and a set of penalties. When I sat the bosses down, I did not promise heaven. I promised predictability. In a trade where unpredictability costs men money and lives, predictability is currency. The commission was a governance model. Vote on trade disputes, enforce territory, codify penalties. When the Bureau says your name, you cannot shrug it off. J. Edgar Hoover's men filed and photographed and whispered. They tried to pin me to every unsolved crime in the city until their file cabinets buckled. The FBI vault still holds pages, correspondence, interviews, surveillance notes, that show a relentless hunt. Men die in ways that require paperwork. That paperwork became my biography in others' hands. The vault is a public museum of obsession. You can pull the pages down and leaf through the years and see how the state followed my shadow with a ferocity equal to my own. This gaze did not end in America. Back in Italy, I lived under other eyes. A press hungry for scandal, ex-allies looking for profit, and old enemies waiting for a misstep. Law had leaned on me, and law had pushed me away. Neither had broken me. I want to be plain. The law needs proof. It does not accept rumors, cool threats, or the poetry of suspicion. When the grand jury, the prosecutor, or the parole board looked at my life, they looked for ledger entries, for sworn testimony, for communications that tied me to a crime beyond control and profit. In 1936, they found enough to convict me of compulsory prostitution. The evidence was photographic, testimonial, and administrative. It was enough under the statutes then in force. The law did its job the way it always would. Imperfectly, shaped by politics and the appetite of the electorate. Yet there remains a tension in the archives. What you can prove in a courtroom and what you know in a room full of men with shared secrets often live in parallel but unconnected worlds. That is where historians and novelists wander, between ledger and rumor. Let me return to the wartime bargain because it is the most damagingly ambiguous part of my biography. Operation Underworld, the name journalists later gave, is a sequence of meetings and agreements in which federal officials sought cooperation from organized crime to secure ports and gather intelligence. Men like Meyer Lansky and others acted as intermediaries. Officials met in dim rooms with dock bosses who promised cooperation. The Navy's intelligence officers and the OSS have left traces. Redacted memos that mention invaluable assistance, lists of names sent to Italian counterintelligence, and post-war notes suggesting mercy for cooperation. Historians still debate how effective we were. The documents, however, show contact and action. Whether you call it collusion or pragmatic policy, it's on the record. Some will say a bargain with criminals is moral rot. Others will say it saved ships and men. I'll say it was a contract, one that gave me leverage and gave them cover. The moment they put me on a ship was surreal. America had been my market. New York had been my cathedral and my brothel. To be banished to Italy was punishment, but exile gifted me a strange autonomy. In Naples, I worked the angles: gambling, connection, the occasional import business. I listened to the old men and learned the new rhythms. I kept up correspondence with men in America. The transatlantic telephone and the occasional courier kept commerce alive. I did what I always did. I organized, but the law followed. The deportation was a neat end from Washington's point of view. They had solved their public problem. For the men who wanted the market untroubled, I was a useful export. For the historians and lawmen who kept the files, I remained dangerous on paper. The pages in the National Archives and in the FBI vault show the legal choreography: petitions, parole board notes, telegrams, and the final act, a removal order. You can line those papers up, and they form a story the tabloids later embroidered. You might sit there and ask, what is the monument of a life like mine? Maybe it's the commission, maybe the bargains during the war, maybe the conviction that made my name infamous. Maybe it's all of those and more. The point is this: organized crime is a mirror held up to power. If you study my files, read the court transcripts, the parole notes, the FBI scans, you'll see the pattern. Not just men in fedoras and Tommy guns, but infrastructure, money, influence, and the ugly arithmetic of control. I built networks. I taught other men how to make networks mean more than fear. I confess to one more sin. I never wrote my story in ink for those who would examine it calmly. Instead, it existed in memos, in ledgers, in men's whispered memories. Years later, historians pulled the wires. They mapped my influence, examined meetings, quoted memos, and unspooled telegrams that had turned up after Freedom of Information petitions. The FBI vault and archives made my private bureaucracy public. Now scholars and documentary makers can read the same pages I once burned at the edges to keep them from being used against friends. If you seek moral absolution in my life, don't. I am an architect of vice, a broker of crime. Men I ordered killed died. Women exploited by the rackets lost dignity and worse. The law that convicted me had sound and sorrow. The people who called for my deportation were not angels. Yet the files show legal process: indictments, depositions, courtroom performances that led to a verdict under the statutes of that day. Those are facts. My defenses, my bargains, my politics. Those are facts too. Now I sit in this dim room and tell you what the papers only hint at. Power is not a single act but 1,000 small trades. Favors, threats, silence. I organized the underworld not because I loved crime, but because I loved order more. I believed in an economy where things ran on an invisible ledger. I thought structure could spare lives by limiting chaos. I was wrong and right in equal measure. The record will stand. Indictments, the trial transcripts, the parole notes, the Navy memos that admit to contact, The FBI files that immortalize obsession? If you want more than confession, read those pages yourself. Visit the vault, pull the archived boxes, see how the law and the underworld danced. This is Lucky Luciano speaking, Salvatore Lucania in the Register of Birth and Sin. I did not repent in a court, and I do not ask your forgiveness now. I only ask you to remember the truth. Systems outlive men. Build them well, and whatever their purpose, they will outlast you.